In this video, I'm going to show you how you can build an AI chatbot that can ask interesting questions. So not like the other chatbot that can just generate responses, but rather a chatbot that you can use as a research assistant or as a partner to generate ideas for your products. And we'll be using two different tools. One is the InfraNodus knowledge graph visualization tool that I created that can represent any text as a knowledge graph and show you the main topics inside, and Dify, which is an open source tool that you can use to create chat flows or chatbot workflows and then embed them to different websites. And this is a really great no-code development tool that I like. I'm not getting paid by them. I just like this product and I want to share it. I think they work really well with InfraNodus. And the special thing about InfraNodus, why it works so well for building a chatbot that would generate questions, is that it can actually represent any text as a knowledge graph, retrieve the main topics inside, but most importantly, it has this content gaps feature that identifies the gaps in the knowledge base and then generates interesting questions based on bridging those gaps. So the questions that you generate will be highly relevant to the knowledge you're working with, but they will connect it in new ways, and this is why those questions are going to be so insightful. And then you can build them into your chatbot workflows here in Dify, and then use those questions to either motivate yourself to think about developing this discourse in an interesting way, or feed them back to the chatbot in order to generate some interesting responses. So I'll show you how you can do all that using InfraNodus and Dify. The first thing that you need to do is to actually ingest a knowledge base inside InfraNodus. In order to do that, you can go into InfraNodus apps here, and then you upload the documents that you want to work with as files through this file import feature. And by the way, I also have another video on our other channel where I show you how to build easier chatbot workflows where you can just ingest the knowledge base directly into Dify and then augment it with InfraNodus inside. So if you're not familiar with building chatbot workflows, I recommend you to watch that video first so you get a little bit more in touch with how Dify works and how InfraNodus works. But if you already know these both tools, then you can jump straight into this workflow. So the first thing that we do is that we ingest the files. Here I have a collection of files. This is basically all 230 articles from the support portal of InfraNodus. I ingest them here. I give them a new name, InfraNodus support portal, for example, and then I make sure that I select the content of the files because I just want to analyze the content. Then I click visualize, and what happens here is that InfraNodus will ingest all those files. The words or the concepts in those files will be represented as the nodes in the graph, and the co-occurrences are the connections. Then we apply different network analysis measures to understand which words have more influence and what are the clusters of ideas that occur together in the same context, and that allows us to have a really nice insight into the structure of this knowledge base. And what's also great is that we have a topical diversity measure that shows you how biased this knowledge base is, and that we can use to optimize this knowledge base and to, for example, remove some of the concepts that take too much attention. That will then, if you don't remove them, the answers that you're going to get are going to be too much focused on those concepts. So we can also use this representation to optimize the knowledge base, right? And then what we're going to do is build a Dify workflow where we will ask InfraNodus to give us those structural insights about this knowledge base, right? And then use them to retrieve interesting information for us that will be relevant to our workflow. So this is what we're going to do, and I will show you how that works. So inside InfraNodus, we generated the visualization of this knowledge base. First of all, we need to look whether or not it's something that we feel is relevant to us, right? Like this is the support portal for InfraNodus, so I know that the concepts of graph network analysis are quite important, so I can keep them in the graph. But I also see some peripheral topics here, like community algorithms, so I can click on those, see what is the context when they're used. In fact, these are all useful information, so I will keep them in the graph. But what I don't want to happen is for it to focus on YouTube, because there's a lot of links to YouTube files, and this is why it has this information here. So I'm going to select those two files, hide them from the graph, automatically everything is recalculated here. So I'm kind of starting to clean my knowledge base and to make sure that it will only contain information that is needed. Then I will also cut off the top layer of concepts here, because I don't want it to be always focused on network analysis and text and graph and even InfraNodus itself. So I will hide it as well. And then, as you can see, it will recalculate the knowledge base structure and then generate some more responses for me, right? So I can actually optimize the knowledge base until I reach the optimal topical diversity here. So if it's in the green, it means that I have distinct topics identified in my knowledge base. Not any single concept is taking too much attention, and now I can use this knowledge base in my chatbot. So if I reach the state that I like, I can import these words that I removed into a permanent list of stop words here, click Save and Reload, and then this knowledge base will permanently have this structure. So in fact, I already did that process before, and here I have a visualization of my kind of ideal structure, which I created using InfraNodus here. So here I have the final knowledge base. I see that it has optimal topical diversity. It also excludes the terms that I don't want to be included into my search results. And here I also have them listed. So now I can be using this knowledge base and query it through my AI chatbot. So this first step is of optimizing your knowledge base until you see the concepts and the topics that you think are highly relevant, and you don't have this kind of general words that take too much attention, and your topical diversity structure is optimal. So this first step of optimizing a knowledge base with InfraNodus is complete. We now have a knowledge graph that represents this knowledge base pretty well. We see that there is like really interesting information here. By the way, I noticed that also I didn't remove that. So for instance, this stuff, TV, I think it's some kind of weird link again, where it's talking about like using videos. Also this whole sign in, avoid recommendation. Let's get rid of that. Leaving comments. So this is all artifacts of the HTML pages. I actually need to add them into the list of stop words. Okay, I think this is much better now. Let us save those into the permanent list. So sometimes you will almost reach the final result, but then you need to rework it until you have much better results here. So then we reload the graph again. Then let's see what's going on. And as I said, you aim for the optimal structure, but sometimes you will also have it show here as medium, but as long as you have modularity, which is above 0.4, then you're good to go, because it's the modularity that you need to be really concerned with. If modularity is too low, it means that the topics are too interconnected, so there will be some kind of bias on a certain idea. Here we have relatively high modularity, and even though topical diversity shows as medium, we're good to go, because we're focused on the topics sufficiently enough, and yet they're distinct from one another. So it really depends on what your preferences are. If you want it to be a little bit focused, you can keep it in the medium. If you want it to be more diverse, you can keep it in the optimal. But what you really need to pay attention to is that the modularity is above 0.4. That means that your knowledge base structure is quite diverse. And sometimes you will not reach it, and then it maybe means that you need to add some more documents into your original knowledge base. So here we have this representation. We have the name of the graph now, which I'm going to copy. And now we can go into Dify and create the actual chatbot workflow that would use this knowledge base to provide interesting questions. So the workflow that I use is actually available via a link that I will provide in the description to this video. But basically what you need to do is to go into Dify and then go into create from blank, and then you use chat flow, and then you give it like a name, and then you click create. And then what you do here is that you import DSL, and there you will import the file which will contain this whole workflow, so you will not need to program itself. And when you import it, you will have something like that appearing, right? With a workflow, which I'm going to explain to you step by step what it's doing. So basically what's happening here is that InfraNodus, Dify is saying, okay, when the user is starting the interaction, you show it a question but inside the features, you make the conversation opener available and you make it into generate questions. So that means that the user in the beginning of the conversation, they will be able to click generate question. And this is how Dify is going to generate a question. And what happens next? When the user clicks this, right? So it's going to say here that if you don't have any information about the knowledge base, you need to do an HTTP request. And here we're using the InfraNodus API. So you will provide the link to the API endpoint of InfraNodus, which generates an advice from the underlying graph structure. You will provide these values. They will actually be in that file, which you can download. But basically what it says here is that you don't want it to be saved. You add the stats for the graph. You optimize for finding the gap because you're generating a question. You include the graph summary because you want to be using that in your prompts, and you don't include the graph because you don't need this additional information. And then in the JSON request, you say that you want to generate a question, you want to use GPT-4o model, then you give the name of the graph. That's very important to change to the one that you're working with. So I created now InfraNodus support portal. This is the one I'm going to use, and I wanted to generate AI topics. And then what happens next is that once it sends this request, it will receive a question that will be generated by InfraNodus. It's going to assign it to internal variable, it's going to convert it, and then it's going to show it to the user. Okay, so now let's try to run it. You will open the preview panel and then you click generate question. And what happens first is that it's going to make a request to this API endpoint that we talked about before. InfraNodus will then identify a random structural gap and then generate a research question for it. So here it says, how can integrating SEO and keyword analysis within the workflow of research publication enhance the discoverability of case studies influencing their publicization and impact in competitive intelligence field? This is great because it's basically asking us how we can use SEO and keyword optimization to make sure that people find scientific research. I think that's actually an amazing question. It makes a lot of sense in relation to what InfraNodus can do. And it's maybe not something that I talk about enough in that knowledge base, in that support portal. So already at this point, just when it generates a question, it already gives me a very good idea of how I could actually improve my support portal and the kind of content that I want to put in. Because this is what InfraNodus did. It identified the content gap, it found something that was missing, and then it generated the question that is now bridging this gap and helping me see how I can develop this context further, how I can make it more interconnected. And so then what I can do at this point is to either just have an idea myself, already from that question. I think, okay, I could write an article about using SEO and keyword optimization for making sure that you publish scientific research that is easily discoverable on the web. So this is something that could be really interesting for scientists. Or I can also copy it and paste it back. And then what will happen next is that it will send this question back to InfraNodus and ask it to generate a response based on this knowledge base. Okay, so it's like asking this question here through the chat box. You can also talk to it inside InfraNodus itself. You can just copy this question and ask it to generate an insight. And by the way, you could also generate the question itself here, and then you could feed it back into the model. So it's basically the same process as you do when you work inside InfraNodus, but all done using the internal API. And then it means that you can expose it as a chatbot, so you don't need to expose the whole graph. So here I'm gonna pose that question back to the graph itself, and then it's using this InfraNodus endpoint, graph and advice post. That's a tool, and I'm going to show you how you can add this tool, and then it will generate an advice that would be able to answer that question. So it will basically find the best possible response through that knowledge base that would answer that question. And it works in the way that is similar to RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation, but the advantage here is that it also has this underlying graph structure. So it's a little bit more clever than standard RAG because it can actually find content that is much more relevant to this original query. And you don't need to augment this query with additional context, like it already has a really nice response. So for example, here it's saying that, that you can dynamically identify discourse gaps. Then you will make the results of your research also more relevant, more visible. And you can also focus on exploring topical clusters in existing research, and you can actually integrate those clusters and also the gaps into your research and make sure that when people search for something that relates to your subject, they will be able to find it, but you will somehow bridge it with new interesting insights, so then it will allow you to generate new interesting content. So you see, it's very interesting because instead of just asking a generic question, we actually generated a very interesting question that brings some added value also to our understanding of this context, and then we generate a response that also lets us develop this whole discourse further and gives us a really good idea. So I like using it on my support portal because I can generate really interesting product ideas and content ideas for it. Imagine that you could also use it, for example, for customer reviews, because then you would also identify the gaps and topics inside and generate some interesting ideas in relation to what the customers are actually saying about your product. But you could also upload a bunch of research papers, make a graph like that, and then make a chatbot that you can use to interact with those research papers using that same approach. So this, I think, is a very useful workflow that you can try. And if you would like to run it, like I said, you can download this DSL file and you just import it here, so you don't need to build it yourself. The only thing that you will need to replace here are the API keys of InfraNodus, and then you can run it. And then, of course, you need the API keys of OpenAI to build that workflow in Dify. One thing that you might need to add also is a special tool. So for example, here I'm using Graph and Advice Post tool. I also make it available in the description to the video. And the way that you can add it into Dify is that you can go into Tools, Custom, Create Custom Tool, and then you paste the scheme of that tool. And then you can use that tool like I have it here in InfraNodus AI Advice. But if you don't want to add any custom tools, you can also actually easily use the HTTP request endpoint. So you just add a new block here. You say that you want to add a HTTP request, and then you just manually create this request. If you have a tool, then you add block, tools, custom, and then you add the custom tool that you want to be using to generate those insights. So basically, you have a full flexibility of how you build this workflow. This example is just to show you that you can use both HTTP requests and Graph Insights Post. And the great thing about InfraNodus is that if you build something like this in Dify, it may seem a bit abstract, but you can always come back to the graph and kind of work through that workflow yourself. Basically, what happens, like I said, you have this gap identified, content gap. InfraNodus first generates a question. So this is what happens at this point here. It generates a question for you here. Okay, it gives you the question so you can read it. And here it says it used a different gap. So it said, how can integrating a public voting mechanism into AI research workflows influence prioritization and transparency of findings shared within academic and public discourse? Okay, so that's a question generated based on this gap. Okay, answer, status, and AI workflow. And then elaborate. Then we ask InfraNodus to answer that question, and this is exactly what happens at that stage when we send that question back to InfraNodus, and then it generates a response for us. So that's also pretty interesting. Like, you can actually observe how it works under the hood, and you can also use different kinds of workflows. Like, if you don't want to generate a question, for instance, you could go into this HTTP request and tell it to generate an idea. Okay, idea. Then it will generate some kind of like a business idea, usually it's going to be. So if I click preview again, it's going to come up with some idea in relation to that. And that's also pretty interesting because you can sometimes use the AI to ideate on how you could develop some products from your knowledge base here. So for example, look, here it proposes me to develop an app that streamlines the workflow of importing, analyzing, and publicizing research findings. It uses AI to detect gaps in market discourse from imported data files, offering a checklist for researchers to publicize their case studies effectively. So that's also good. It's kind of like a product idea that is created based on this whole knowledge base that I have. And also one other thing that you can adjust if you want is that you can choose to have a specific gap generated. So if you add a parameter that's called gap depth, and you add a number from 1 to 4, then you can generate like the content based on a specific gap. So for example, if I want to be using a gap number 2, I could do that, and then if I use the question here, it would always focus on the same gap. So you have a lot of variations here. You can read about them on the documentation page about the API, and you also have the same parameters here, but the only thing that you need to change is actually the name of the graph that you're working with. So that's the only thing that you would need to change from the default version. All right, so I hope you find it interesting. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and also please see the link to the tutorial where I explain this workflow in more detail. This video is more of an overview, but if you follow the detailed tutorial, then you will be able to replicate this as well. And if you've never used Dify, also please refer to the other video I linked to with a more simplified workflow where we just use the data from InfraNodus to augment user prompts. So that might be a good video to start with if you've never used InfraNodus or Dify, just to get into it. And then you will be able to build these more complex workflows with more steps as well. Thank you.